Whoops. Apologies, everyone. I think when Karen stepped off the call,
I think that's exactly what happened, John.
I think, apologies, everyone. I think that we were not made co-hosts, and so uh, we'll give a moment to
That was an
All right.
awesome presentation, Lauren.
That was great.
Thank you.
I
I
love
really
that you
dug into it.
All right. All right.
Okay,
Let's
we're
try
gonna
that again.
start.
And yeah. And Javel, you're recording, correct?
It's automatically recording, yeah.
Okay, great.
Cool. All right.
Sorry about that. Let's do it
That's
again.
okay. Okay. Do we have a quorum? Yeah. Okay. All right. I won't start over. I have no disclosures except that I am a resident at Adult Medicine Clinic. This population is near and dear to my heart. And sort of the primary impetus for why I wanted to do this presentation, I wanted to learn more about Harborview as an institution and hopefully more about the patients who we serve. All right, so as an overview, I've split this talk into three parts. Part one will be about the history, how did Harborview come to exist? Part two is who do we serve now? And part three is really looking forward into the future. How do we build an equity-focused mission or improve the equity surrounding the patients that we serve? So part one, in the past, our story begins in the northwest corner of the United States, what was formerly the Oregon Territory, where the Coast Salish people have lived and thrived for thousands of years before any white settlers arrived. They had rich cultures, languages, and traditions that were intricately tied to the land and the waters of this area. But there's one man, Chief Sial, who was instrumental in shaping how the region changed once the settlers did arrive. And he eventually lended his name to the small village at the end of the Duwamish River, which became the city of Seattle. A lot of my talk will also incorporate bits of Seattle history. As a non-Seattleite, I thought they were interesting, I think relevant to how Harborview came about as well. So we started in the 1850s. In 1853, Washington officially became a territory. And in 55 and 56, there were several treaties, the most salient of which was the Treaty of Point Elliott, which is signed by Chief Seale, Governor Isaac Stevens, and other leaders, in which Native peoples were convinced to sign away large amounts of land, their ancestral lands, in exchange for a little bit of money and nominal recognition by the US federal government. There was an entire war that broke out afterwards, but it was through this series of treaties that paved the way for white settlers to come in and claim large swaths of land for themselves. And the area in pink, extending from Bellingham all the way down to essentially Mount Rainier, that was the area that was ceded in the Treaty of Point Elliott. So how exactly does that relate to Harborview? Multiple of the articles that I read focused on this man, David or Doc Maynard. He was a jack of all trades, including a physician, a farmer, a justice of the peace, a negotiator of treaties with the Native Americans, a merchant. He's also pretty chaotic. As a merchant, he would routinely buy and sell goods for half the price as everyone else, which made all of his competitors very angry and made him very popular amongst the people, especially those who couldn't afford goods that everyone else was selling. As a landowner, he owned part of what is now downtown Seattle, Pioneer Square. And he, along with two of the other major landowners, Arthur Denny and Carson Boren, could not agree about how to align their street grids. And so that is why downtown Seattle looks like this today. Chaotic. And as a physician, he had originally trained, I think in Ohio, had made his way across the United States, and he decided to build a 2-bed hospital in present-day Pioneer Square. His wife, Catherine, served as the hospital's single nurse, and they served everyone. Didn't matter if you were white, if you were Native American, if you couldn't pay, if you could pay, they would see everyone. And it was this mission that also led to the financial decline of this hospital. And so the hospital closed a few years later. So really, that is I think the first true hospital in Seattle. But as part of the legal mandate given to the King County commissioners at the time, they were charged with taking care of the poor, the unhoused, the mentally ill, and the physically ill, who had nowhere else to go in the county. And so the commissioners at the time decided to set aside a plot of land south of the city in what is now the Georgetown area, but they named it the Poor Farm, a little bit too tongue-in-cheek, I would say. And so this was a place where people who had no other resources could turn. And in May of 1877, they built a 6-bed hospital named the King County Hospital on the banks of the Duwamish River. And they were able to find 3 nuns, the Sisters of Providence, who volunteered to take care of patients here. And they very quickly realized that running a hospital with almost no funds, miles and miles away from downtown Seattle, where everyone else lived, was just silly. So about a year later, they relocated to 5th and Madison and built their own hospital. They pulled their own money to build it, and they named it Providence Hospital, which incidentally is what became the Providence organization that now owns Swedish as we know it today. In those early years, they saw up to 200 patients per year. They did accept private pay at this new location to help fund their mission. And eventually their list of patients included bartenders, carpenters, police officers, people of all walks of life who were immigrating to this new city or this new town. And I thought it was interesting, some of the diagnoses that they recorded for patients at the time, in addition to like typical musculoskeletal injuries and infectious disease, also included whiskey as a diagnosis, which they later scratched out and wrote alcoholism. And here's the house that they built, which eventually became Providence Hospital. So everything was, fine and dandy for the next 10 years, but in 1887, religious tensions between the Protestant, political leaders of King County and the Catholic sisters came to a head. And so they took back their charge and their mission to take care of the poor in King County. And in 1980, they hire another doctor to run the new hospital. In 1994, we build a new King County Hospital, this time with 125 beds. It actually looks pretty nice. And finally, we have like a nice brick and mortar building to take care of the poor and the indigent in the county. So this came just in time. In 1989, the Great Fire, or the Great Seattle Fire, began. And in my reading, this fire is often attributed to a paint shop on like the 2nd floor of this building in downtown Seattle. There are other records that I found that this is actually caused by a single guy. He was warming a pot of glue over a fire, stepped away for about 30 minutes, came back, the pot of glue is on fire. He decides to throw water instead of snuffing it out, and instead starts a massive grease fire in a building that is completely made of wood. So there are some interviews at the time of this person. They had found him before he quickly left town. He seems pretty apologetic. So this fire essentially takes out the entire business district in Seattle, burns 25 blocks. And though I couldn't find records that it affected Providence Hospital, ostensibly it could have reached Fifth and Madison at the time. Luckily, there are some enterprising young doctors who set up shop almost immediately after and plied their trade as physicians, even amongst this catastrophe. And at the end of the 19th, or I guess at the turn of the century, the Seattle population nearly doubles. And this is due in large part to the discovery of gold up in northern Canada and Alaska and the Klondike River. And so almost overnight, Seattle turns from a small town to a bustling port city where tens of thousands of people come to prepare for their journey up north in search of gold. So this brings us back to King County Hospital. City's growing, they need more space. They end up building a new wing and expand the hospital to 225 beds. In the ensuing decades, there are multiple infectious epidemics that sweep through the city, among which are the Spanish flu, cholera, diseases of public health, truthfully. And some of the reports that I read reported that by the 1920s, the hospital was so crowded that patients' beds lined the corridors. And in the late 1920s, there was a survey done of regional public hospitals where it really highlighted just the poor hygiene in these hospitals and the need to continue to increase capacity to care for patients. So what is the city to do? But build a new one, build a new hospital. So in 1928, the King County voters approved a $2.7 million bond issue, which is equivalent to $48 million today, to construct a new hospital. They choose to build it on First Hill. It's supposed to be a beacon of light, of hope for the city. And in a poll by the Seattle Times, the name Harborview is chosen due to its position overlooking Elliott Bay. And you might be wondering why exactly in First Hill? Although I couldn't find exact information at the time, First Hill was this intersection, or was this intersection of both people who needed Harborview's care, so those who were poor, who had no other resources, as well as those who had nowhere else to live or go. And so in the 1920s, this is when increasing amounts of racially restrictive covenants were created, which restricted land and home ownership for non-white people to very few neighborhoods, what we know as present-day Central District and International District. This was formally codified by the Federal Housing Authority in the 1930s, where they created these maps of security ratings for neighborhoods that almost entirely correlated or inversely correlated with their racial diversity. And so Harborview today sits at the corner of what was a grade D area or a redlined area and the industrial district. So I'll speed through a little bit here. It's the beginning of the 1930s. We've got this new hospital. In 1931, UW Nursing School opens. Their nurses live in Harborview Hall, right across the street from Harborview. But unfortunately, this is also the start of the Great Depression. So between 1930 and 35, unemployment doubles. Hoovervilles pop up around Seattle, the biggest of which is south of Pioneer Square. There are 1,000 men just living in shanties that they had built in an abandoned shipbuilding yard. And yet Harborview continues to see patients. So by 1939, on the outpatient side, they're treating up to 500 patients a day in a facility built to only handle 75 patients per day. And around this time, they continually apply for additional funding, but are voted down by King County voters. And then World War II happens, which could be its own talk. But in terms of Seattle demographics, one of the major changes was Japanese internment that had happened, that started in 1942, which single-handedly decimated the entirety of Japantown. At the time, Japantown was this bustling city center or neighborhood that extended from Fifth Avenue all the way to 23rd Avenue between Jackson and Main Street. And almost overnight, those businesses all closed. Those people are forced to leave. After the war, in 1946, Harborview continues to be filled to 150% capacity. There are reports that visitors were denied entry because there was actually just no room for them to stand. People are coughing on each other in the hallways. It feels very reminiscent of some areas in Harborview right now. And luckily in 1948, we get our first break as an institution. Voters approve a small expansion that results in the construction of East Clinic, which is where the present day like addiction medicine consults sit, if any of you have rotated through there. But it's not for a while that we get additional funding, and our next major break is when the current day Montlake Hospital opens. So they're able to siphon some of the patients and some of the surgery cases to the other hospital and allow for some decongestion at Harborview itself. So I'll speed through this part too, but from the 1960s onward, Harborview really hits its stride as a leading medical institution in the area. In 1966, voters approve a $15 million bond issue, equivalent to $147 or $147 million in today's money. And this allows for the construction of West Hospital and West Clinic. In 67, UW takes over the clinical management of Harborview. So this is the start of a very fruitful partnership where Harborview physicians are staffed or are like professors and faculty of the university, while King County and the people retain ownership over the actual property. And in the late 60s and early 70s, we really become a hospital that is known on the national stage with the establishment of Medic One, one of still, I think, one of the best paramedic training organizations in the country. And this is established by our cardiologist, Dr. Leonard Cobb, and then Seattle Fire Chief Gordon Vickery. There was a 60-minute I think documentary done on Medic One, and in that period we became known as the city to have a heart attack in, because our out of hospital cardiac arrest rates were so much better than everywhere else. So in the 70s, we poach a new chair of surgery from UT Southwestern, who brings with him 12 amazing burn and trauma surgeons. They help establish Harborview as the center for research and for burn and trauma care. And in 1975 and in 1982, Dr. Michael Kopass really elevates, I think, the Medic One program and establishes Airlift Northwest, the air ambulance service that still exists, that brings patients to Harborview by air. And this allows Harborview to serve as the WAMI region's level 1 trauma center, the only one that we have. And moving forward into the 1980s, when the HIV/AIDS pandemic began, Harborview again became a place where people could seek care when they had nowhere else to turn. And at the height of our Madison clinic, in the early 1990s, the Madison Clinic was seeing around 800 patients a year, most of whom could not be seen anywhere else or were refused elsewhere, and who were expected to die within the year. So again, that was a whirlwind, but that brings us to today. What is Harborview today, and who do we serve? So this is the Harborview mission statement. It's very long. Written by a bunch of politicians, apparently. But I think the nice thing about this mission statement is that we clearly delineate the populations that we are dedicated to serving. And so the ones that I want to focus on in this section are people who are non-English speaking poor, people who are uninsured or underinsured, and people who require specialized burn and trauma care. So this is a little bit on Harborview statistics. Luckily, as a public institution, a lot of our data is publicly available. And so this is information that I was able to obtain both from the internet and from just asking various faculty. In terms of our payer mix, like many public hospitals, we are primarily seeing Medicare and Medicaid patients, which do reimburse at lower rates than commercial insurance. Here are some of our key performance indicators, and the ones that I've highlighted just really show like the number of the volume of patients that we take care of. So in 2022, for instance, we saw 15,000 patients on the inpatient side, had 50,000 emergency room visits, and on the outpatient side, saw a combined 250,000 people. That's a lot of people moving through our hallways. And I'm not sure if you guys can see it very clearly, but our case mix index is also listed here, which is 2.6. And that is a marker for the complexity of patients seen at our institution. In comparison, the national average for case mix index is around 1.5. And so we are seeing much more complex patients here, which makes sense since we are both safety net and a quaternary referral center. And this is data that I actually just got this morning. It's a demographic or a graphical representation of the self-reported race and ethnic groups of patients seen at Harborview in 2022. I guess it might not be surprising. The majority of our patients we see do identify as white, but a significant portion identify as multiple races and as Asian. And I did not have time to look into why exactly the numbers for people who identify as Black are lower. I'm guessing it was a clerical issue, but I will have to look back. Again, I got the data this morning, but I thought it was interesting enough to share. And in terms of ethnicity, majority of our patients are non-Hispanic or Latino, but we do have like between, I think, 3,000 and 6,000 patients we see who do identify with those groups. And in terms of Medicare specific data, I really just wanted to highlight that the medicine services see a large number of Medicare patients. They're second only to orthopedics, yet we charge and are reimbursed at a much lower rate compared to different surgery services like CT surgery, neurosurgery, and there's a catch-all surgery line here, which includes trauma, acute care, elective surgeries. And so really, I think understanding some of the finances can help us also understand what the hospital priorities are at a time when we're trying to keep our doors open. It's also indicative of a global system that values procedures more than cognitive care or cognitive work. And just stepping into finances briefly, I am not a business person, but I thought it was interesting just to look at how the kind of budget that Harborview operates with. And the thing that I found most compelling here is that in 2022, we lost $19 million just from operating expenses. And even with federal aid related to the COVID pandemic and with state appropriations and with investments, we were only able to whittle that down to $4 million. And so I think the learning point for me was that Harborview operates with fairly thin margins, and there are years when we dip below that margin. And yet we continue to provide millions of dollars of uncompensated care. And in 2022 alone, provided almost $40 million of financial assistance, which means patients do not pay for any of their care that is required. And there's some articles that I read that quoted us at almost $30 million in uncompensated care, including the cost of care for Medicaid and Medicare patients. That goes unreimbursed because those insurances bill at or reimburse at a lower rate. And in terms of our trauma mission, there are mechanisms that the state and the federal government can supplement some of the uncompensated care that we provide, but it's a bit unclear just from the public data how much support we get there. The trauma system is also very interesting unto itself. I won't go into it too much, but essentially Harborview is here in the Central District. And in 1990, there were multiple there was a massive piece of legislation that established how we triage and how we split up the different trauma regions. The major reason for why Harborview is the only level 1 trauma center here was based on state population need at the time, and this desire to maintain a high volume academic center that was focused on advancing care for injured patients. So they wanted Harborview to be the place to funnel all other patients. And as of 2017, an estimated 80% of our population was within 1 hour of a level 1 or 2 center by ground or air. So not everybody, but at least a significant portion of our population. Okay, so that brings us to the future. And I apologize, I'm not checking the chat. So if there are any like clarifying questions that I should be answering. Okay, cool. So my question for you all is, how do these statistics impact us as residents and as future physicians in this area and the care that we provide? And for this section, I'll focus on persons or people who are non-English speaking poor and people who are uninsured or underinsured. So this question of the Harborview mission has come up before, actually fairly recently in 2015. UW had announced at the time that it would close critical care and community clinics at Harborview, which caused a rift and a delay in contract negotiation between UW and Harborview. While this move may have made sense financially, as you saw in previous slides, the public backlash was swift. UW was accused of losing sight of our core mission, which was to be a safety net hospital. And closing the clinic seemed to represent a shift in our priorities, which was so clearly delineated in our original mission statement. But I think this does bring up good points. Who exactly do we serve? And also, where are the people we serve? And does it make sense to have Harborview clinics in an area like First Hill? And so for this, I looked at the Civil Rights and Labor History Consortium website. This is a project started and currently run by a professor at UW in the history department. And he and his team have spent a lot of hours just mapping out, I guess, different civil rights issues and how they have impacted the landscape in Seattle. So this particular series is a series of maps just showing the demographic changes in Seattle throughout the last 10 decades. So 1940 was the first year that census data was available in enough granular detail to be able to create these maps. As a reminder, at this time, there were racially restrictive covenants that excluded non-white families from home ownership. And so all of the non-white folks are concentrated in these areas, as you see. So Central District, International District. And this trend really continues throughout the 50s and 60s, despite an almost doubling of population for all ethnic groups or all racial groups. And at the end of the 60s, there were multiple attempts made within Washington state to challenge discriminatory housing policies, but it wasn't until 1968, after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, that a bill was passed really codifying fair housing policies and making discrimination based on race illegal in the city. This was eventually amended to provide protections so that people could not be discriminated for other reasons like sexual orientation, marital status, etc. And we do start to see a change in demographics through the 90s. So you'll see here that there are more people that, I guess, more ethnic enclaves or more non-white communities that spring up more to the south of Seattle. And in the 2000s to the 2020s, we really start to see the impacts of changing industries in Seattle. This is tech. So now there are many communities and neighborhoods in Seattle that are majority non-white. A stark difference from 60 years ago. So you might be wondering, well, race doesn't say everything. Like Harborview's mission is to take care of the poor, those who can't afford it. So how about that? And I think that's the same question that I had. So I looked at the King County Census Viewer, which essentially maps out demographic data across King County based on census data. And the main takeaway here is that a larger proportion of our impoverished people, so people who live below 200% of the federal poverty line, do live in South Seattle. And they correlate very roughly with communities of color. It's not a one-to-one, but there is overlap. And I can't talk about housing in Seattle without talking about homelessness. This also could be a talk all on its own, but I think people who are unhoused really represent the intersection of who Harborview is trying to take care of. And so I did find it really interesting based on some of the housing authority data that it seems like the majority of encampments, at least in 2023, were in and around the Harborview area, at least in downtown and Soto, places where ostensibly you could access Harborview a little bit easier by foot or by public transportation. And I was reminded of my patients when going through this talk, who live in Des Moines, who live in Kent, in Burien. And I was curious, how much do they have to go through to see me on a regular basis? So just through a quick Google Maps search, it was very clear that my patients who live in Des Moines have to jump through many hoops to see me. One of my most complex patients actually lives in Des Moines, and if she were to take public transportation, she'd have to take multiple bus transfers or link transfers, not to mention that she is wheelchair bound or has to use a walker on good days. The same thing goes for Kent, which is a little bit more of a straight line or a straight shot to Harborview, but still quite far away. And many of Harborview patients, you guys might have noticed, use Access to get around. Access is a great resource. I would say like 50% of my patient panel uses Access, but it's not without its faults. Access is chronically underfunded and understaffed. And so often my patients will arrive an hour early, an hour late, because there just aren't enough vehicles to transport patients who need it. And so that brings me to my last point. Just reflecting on the distribution of hospitals in Puget Sound, we don't have a lack of hospitals. There's at least 15 on this map that I can count, not including the VA and other private clinics. But I think based on the demographic data that I've shown you all, I think it's very clear that for our mission population who lives more in South Seattle, they're likely to go to VMC or multi-care for their care rather than Harborview due to proximity alone. And the same thing applies for outpatient clinics. Harborview itself does not own any clinics other than Pioneer Square Clinic, which is located kind of in like Cherry Hill, Beacon Hill area, with the exception of some of the Madison Clinic satellites that serve HIV patients only. But the remainder of UW clinics are actually majority north of the city, in the city or north of the city. And there are only 2 clinics south of the city that are open right now. So again, when patients are looking for primary care, they're more likely, honestly, to go to Health Point, to the Seattle Indian Health Board, or other community care organizations, again, due to proximity and access reasons. So what are my takeaways? I think the shining beacon amongst all of this is that Harborview's mission has really remained the same for 100 years. We as an institution have made it a priority to take care of patients who cannot go anywhere else. And yet we now exist in a time when our mission population likely does not live solely around Harborview. And that has naturally increased barriers to accessing care. I think we can point fingers at a lot of different problems, but among the ones that Harborview has to face, these are representative of systems level inequities that we alone cannot fix, or we, even as the UW Medicine, cannot fix. There are issues with how we finance healthcare, with how we choose to reimburse certain specialties or certain types of work more than others. There are issues with how we build housing in Seattle. We all know how housing is very scarce, and there are a multitude of reasons for that, including zoning laws and where multi-generational, multi-unit homes can be built. I'll just say that in 75% of Seattle, I think it still is only legal to build single unit family homes. And so that greatly limits where people with more limited resources can live. And then there's evidence of systemic racism within all levels of policies within our city and likely within our institution. And they have to be dismantled in order for Harborview to provide more equitable care. That being said, there's not one catch-all solution that will help us to deliver care to the people who need it. And then at the end of the day, I am grateful I'm able to show up to Harborview and with the resources that I have, make these like deep connections with patients who make an effort to see me. And I don't take that for granted for even a second. So special thanks to Duncan Reed. I hope he's on this talk. But he is a former GITCU grad, a current international medicine clinic attending, and through our conversations about Harborview really inspired me to delve into this topic and to do this talk. And Karen and the RDC were really helpful in giving me feedback and shaping the issues that I chose to focus on here. So with that, I'll stop.
Lauren, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm going to share a question that Amelia had in the chat, which was, did you come across anything in your reading about why so many hospitals are concentrated on First Hill beyond Harborview?
I think That's a good question. I didn't exactly find the answer, but my instinct was that once there was one hospital in the area, it almost seemed natural for other hospitals to pop up. First Hill has gone through its own like dramatic changes in history, its own ups and downs. Okay, so no, I didn't find an exact answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Austin's asking, where is funding coming from to help Harborview continue to operate while taking millions of dollars of loss each year?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And honestly, we are not necessarily funded by any particular institution. Like we are a very lean organization that historically has been supported by our own operating costs. So I think in like off the book conversations that I've had with people who are higher up, it's very clear that surgery and trauma, those are the things that bring in money that enable our mission. Whether or not that's the right thing, I think is a different question, but we don't receive a large portion of funds from any particular organization.
Yeah, we do get some offsets in terms of from the county. As we all know, we're a county and state that doesn't have a consistent income tax. I mean, we don't have an income tax, right? So the funding is oftentimes sort of dependent on the whims of the legislature. They've continued to fund us very, very well. We oftentimes, in some ways, get better support than the university. And those numbers that you showed actually are similar to the numbers that happen at UWMC as well. So there's huge swings in numbers. The offsets that we got from federal sources from the pandemic happened and then they went away at the beginning of this year. And so there's a lot of consternation and worry about what that means for our ability to continue to operate. This is an amazing talk and really lovely reminder of just how special Harborview is. If you look around the country, safety net hospitals, many of them have gone the way of the dodo and other extinct animals because they're very, very hard and precious to run. So thank you for that reminder. I'm going to stop us here because we have a brief announcement from our guests. Laura, if you're on, I think I saw you on.
Hi, I am.
Oh, there you are. I had to find you.
Yeah.
Laura Granados is a graduate from our program who made a brief presentation last week, but since interns were gone last week, has agreed to come back and very briefly share a little bit about a project that she's doing and wanting our help with. So, Laura.
Great, thank you. And I'm happy that I caught some of Lauren's presentation. That was so great. So thank you for having me. I spoke with some of you last week, but I was hoping to capture the interns as well. So I'm Laura. I know a lot of you. I'm a former GITCU alumna, and I'm now a home critical care fellow, and I'm on the medical education track on fellowship. I'm interested in the medical culture around perfectionism, and I'm here to tell you about and hopefully pick your interest and invite you to participate in a research project that I'm involved in. With this project, we're hoping to better understand the role of medical error in education with the goal to ultimately find ways to better support trainees through these events. Research to date has shown that making a medical error is incredibly common, yet most trainees involved in one feel shame and inadequacy, and also feel that their training didn't necessarily help them know how to cope with the emotional consequences of going through that event. So if you're interested in participating, and you think that you've been involved in a medical error at any point in your training, it doesn't necessarily need to be during residency. I'm going to ask you to fill out a quick 1-minute survey. I'll share the link in the message portion of Zoom.